In America, there are two kinds of confinement. One is punishment, a sentence handed down after a conviction. The other is something far stranger, a legal pressure tool, a mechanism meant to coerce, not condemn. A tool that, in theory, you can walk away from at any time, if you give the court what it wants. But what happens when a man insists he can't give the court what it wants? What happens when a judge believes he's lying? And what happens when that belief becomes the foundation of a prison cell that refuses to open? This is the story of H Beatty Chadwick, a man who spent 14 years behind bars without ever being convicted of a crime. A man held not for what he did, but for what a court believed he could do. In 1992, a marriage ended. A divorce filing, ordinary on its face, set off a chain of events that would become one of the most extraordinary legal sagas in American history. H Beatty Chadwick, a Philadelphia area lawyer, claimed he had transferred $2.5 million to pay off a debt in Gibraltar. A complicated financial move, but not unheard of. But in 1994, investigators uncovered something that changed everything. 3 annuity contracts, bought and redeemed using $869,000 from Gibraltar. To the court, this wasn't a coincidence. It was a revelation, a sign that the money hadn't vanished, it had been hidden. The judge ruled the transfers fraudulent, and with that ruling came an order: return the $2.5 million. Chadwick refused. He insisted the money was gone, lost in investments, lost in timing, lost in decisions he could no longer undo. But the court didn't believe him. And in civil contempt, belief is everything. In 1995, a bench warrant was issued. During the arrest, Chadwick resisted. He was convicted of assault. And then he was taken into custody, not for the assault, but for refusing to comply with the civil order. Inside a cell, Chadwick repeated the same story. The money was gone. Outside, the court repeated its own. The money was hidden. And between those two narratives, a man's freedom evaporated. Days became months. Months became years. And the door stayed locked. As the years dragged on, the case of H. Beatty Chadwick stopped being a divorce dispute and became a legal battlefield. Every motion, every appeal, every hearing was another attempt to define the limits of judicial power. Chadwick's lawyers argued the obvious. If a man cannot comply, then holding him indefinitely serves no purpose. Civil contempt is supposed to coerce, not punish. And coercion only works if compliance is possible. But the court held firm. They believed Chadwick was hiding the money. And if he was hiding it, then he could return it. And if he could return it, then he could walk free at any time. The logic was circular, but airtight enough to justify keeping him behind bars. Appeals courts reviewed the case. Some expressed concern. Others deferred to the trial judge. No one wanted to be the one to say the system had gone too far. No one wanted to undermine the authority of a judge enforcing his own order. And so the legal war became a stalemate. A man insisting he had nothing left to give. A court insisting he was choosing imprisonment over compliance. And an appellate system unwilling to intervene. Meanwhile, the world outside moved on. New laws were passed. New scandals came and went. But inside his cell, Chadwick lived the same day over and over. A man trapped in a legal paradox that no one seemed willing to resolve. By the early 2000s, he had spent more time in civil contempt than anyone in American history. Longer than many criminal sentences. Longer than some murderers. Longer than the system ever intended. And still, the court insisted, he could walk free at any time. All he had to do was return the money. But if the money was truly gone, then freedom was impossible. And the law had become a trap with no exit. By the early 2000s, the case of H. Beatty Chadwick had become something the American legal system had never seen before. For years past, then 6, then 10, and still, the court insisted he held the keys to his own cell. But time has a way of revealing the truth. And as the years accumulated, the logic behind his confinement began to crack. If a man has not broken after a decade, is he defiant? Or is he telling the truth? If coercion has failed for 10 years, is it still coercion? Or has it quietly transformed into punishment? Civil contempt was designed to be temporary. A short, sharp pressure. But Chadwick's confinement had become a monument to judicial certainty. A certainty that could not be questioned without unraveling the very authority that created it. Judges came and went. Lawyers retired. Administrators changed. But the order remained. A single line in a decades-old divorce case, echoing through time. Return the money. And still, Chadwick insisted he could not. Outside the prison walls, legal scholars began to take notice. Articles were written. Questions were raised. How long can a man be held for something he cannot do? How long can a court insist on a reality that may not exist? And what happens when the system becomes so invested in its own narrative that it cannot imagine being wrong? Inside his cell, Chadwick aged. Seasons changed. Years blurred. The world moved forward without him. Technology advanced. Presidents came and went. But his reality remained frozen. A man trapped in a legal paradox that no one seemed willing to resolve. By the 14th year, the case had become a symbol, not of guilt or innocence, but of a system that had lost the ability to correct itself. A system that had turned a civil tool into a life sentence. And still, the door stayed closed. In 2009, after 14 years of confinement, something finally shifted. Not because of new evidence, not because of a confession, not because the money was found, but because a new judge, looked at the case and saw what others had refused to see. He saw that coercion had failed. He saw that the purpose of civil contempt had been exhausted. He saw that the system had crossed a line it was never meant to cross. And with a single ruling, the longest civil contempt incarceration in American history came to an end. After 14 years, H Beatty Chadwick walked out of prison. No parade, no apology, no declaration of innocence. Just a man stepping into a world that had moved on without him. He had not been exonerated. He had not been vindicated. He had simply outlasted the logic that kept him confined. Reporters asked him the same question the court had asked for years. Where is the money? And Chadwick gave the same answer he had always given. It was gone. Some believed him. Some didn't. But the truth, whatever it was, no longer mattered. Because the system had finally admitted what it had refused to acknowledge for 14 years. That coercion cannot last forever. That belief is not evidence. And that a man cannot be held indefinitely for something he cannot do. In the aftermath, legal scholars debated the case. Some called it a failure. Others called it a warning. But all agreed on one thing. The Chadwick case exposed a flaw in the machinery of civil justice. A flaw that allowed a man to disappear into a system with no sentence, no end date, and no clear path to freedom. Chadwick lived the rest of his life quietly. No lawsuits. No memoir. No crusade. Just a man who had spent 14 years in a cell built not by crime, but by certainty. And in the end, his story became a reminder of something the system often forgets. That power, once exercised, must be checked. That belief must be tested. And that freedom cannot depend on a judge's assumption about what a man might be capable of. Because when the law stops questioning itself, it stops being justice.